Welkom met de Andere Krant. Covert behavioral manipulation techniques, also called nudges, have widely been used by government and media to instill obedience to so-called healthcare measures that were taken during the COVID crisis. Psychologist Dr. Gary Sidley has various ethical concerns about the use of these techniques and has taken action together with 40 other psychological health practitioners to demand a public inquiry into the government's use of covert manipulation techniques. Today he joins us to share his insights. Gary, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good. So for the people who don't know you yet, because I think a lot of people in the UK are familiar with your work, but can you explain for the Dutch audience a little bit more about your background?
Okay. Yes. In a nutshell, my background was I left school at 18, went to university to do proper science, biochemistry and physiology degree. Graduated with that when I was 21, and then went to work in mental health, initially as a psychiatric nurse, but for the most part, since 1987, as a clinical psychologist in the UK's National Health Service. So I spent most of my career working with adults with severe mental health problems, up until my early retirement in 2013. From that point onwards, I put a lot of my spare time into campaigning for improved mental health services. So I think we can do a lot better than what we have in the West with mental health provision. Until, of course, COVID came along in 2020. And I, along with many other mental health colleagues, had been fighting what we saw as like a psychiatric tyranny, biological psychiatry kind of institution. And now we had a much bigger tyranny, in my view, to deal with. So I was very unsettled by it from January, February 2020. I knew this wasn't right where we were going. It didn't feel right. And I knew that something really strange was happening. So since that time, I've spent my free time engaged in various campaigning groups, including HEART, which is the Health Advisory and Recovery Team, which you may not have heard of in the Netherlands, but it's in the UK is kind of an alternative to the experts that advise our government. We've kind of put forward a different narrative. Also involved in Panda, which is kind of into more researchy kind of things. I'm involved in a project there around propaganda and nudging. And also a co-founder of the Smile Free campaign, which is a small anti-mask mandate group, smilefree.org, which keeps me busy.
Well, that sounds busy.
Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to speak with you is, of course, Laura Dodsworth. She wrote the book State of Fear about how the UK government weaponized fear. And she goes into all the application of these behavioral insights. And I started browsing the government websites in the Netherlands, and I found with us, the names are of course different, but we have the same type of nudge units. And even though we don't have like a panic paper, like the Spy B paper that advised to increase fear, you actually see like almost exactly the same kind of messaging. And in the Netherlands, I was looking for psychologists that would criticize this application of behavioral sciences, but it was very difficult to find one. And then I came across your letter that you signed together with 40 other psychologists, I believe. And I thought your criticism was very spot on, but also from the basis of psychology. So perhaps for our audience, could you explain how do these psychological manipulation techniques work, and why do you think they're kind of ethically dubious?
Right, okay. Well, psychological nudges could be defined as, psychological techniques of persuasion that tend to impact upon their targets largely below their level of conscious awareness. So they're quite covert, and so people are being influenced without them necessarily being aware of it. And in very simple terms, what nudging does, it kind of exploits the fact that human beings are on automatic pilot most of the time. One way of looking at it, an oversimplified way, but I think it's quite useful, is to look at our brains as having two different kind of domains, a fast and a slow, sometimes called as 1 and 2, but fast and slow is probably the most helpful distinction. The fast brain is automatic, it doesn't need any effort, it's got kind of almost limitless capacity, whereas the slow brain is more deliberative and effortful, and is very low in capacity. So what happens is that humans tend to be on fast brain 99% of the time, really, which for the most part is really efficient, and it works well for us, and it stops us having to agonise over the minutiae of every single decision that we have to make in our day-to-day life. And it often kind of gets things right as well, to be fair, even though we don't really think about these things, so. For example, if I'm walking down the street this afternoon and everybody's running in the opposite direction, I'll probably turn around and start running with them. And that might be a good call. I wouldn't have to think too much about that. I'd be following like what they call a normative pressure nudge, a norm, that we do like to do what the majority of people do. And often that works out well. However, and this is where it becomes a little bit sinister, I think, our governments have certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, 10 to 12 years maybe, started to employ behavioural scientists in pretty much every department of our government. I think people would be surprised at how many behavioural scientists are actually state funded. And what they've been doing is, during the COVID crisis, they've been exploiting this tendency for us to be on automatic pilot by using a whole range of nudges to get us to do what they would believe and the state would believe to be the right thing. Which in this, they would say is following the restrictions and the vaccination program. And so there's a whole raft of nudges that they draw on. But it might be useful for me to mention the three that I think do have real kind of some important questions about their ethical basis. The first and probably the most commonly known is fear. To use the jargon of behavioural science, this is the affect nudge. And it's based on the idea that a frightened population is usually a compliant one. So there has been strategic and concerted efforts to ramp up the levels of fear of people around the COVID issue as a way of getting us to do what the government wants us to do. So that's the first one that's ethically questionable. The second one would be what they call the ego nudge, which exploits the fact that human beings like to see themselves as good, virtuous, decent people. So what's happened over the last 2 and a bit years is that the nudgers have equated strict following of the rules with being a good person, and the converse, not following the rules, means you're a bad guy. You're not a
yes.
And then the third one is what I alluded to with the example of people running in the opposite direction, is normative pressure. Humans do not like to find themselves in a minority. It can be very uncomfortable. So again, the nudges have exploited that in a number of ways by highlighting that those people who are not following the restrictions or who aren't energetically pursuing the vaccine program are somehow deviant, somehow this kind of out group. And those together, I think, do raise some pretty major ethical problems. Again, I could outline for you quickly what the 4 ethical dimensions
Yes, please.
are.
Yes.
That be useful. Yeah, I think they're ethical questions. Some of these do overlap, but I think they're ethical questions around the methods, around the goals, around the issue of consent, and around transparency.
Yes.
So with regards to the methods, I think there are ethical questions about should a civilized so-called democracy strategically inflict emotional distress on its population as a way of getting them to do the right thing, or for the common good, or what's socially responsible, and these rather sinister phrases that keep popping up in the news by the state when they're trying to justify these things. The other thing about the methods, of course, is the unintended consequences as well. The collateral damage of them. When you're using fear, shaming, and peer pressure or scapegoating to get people to do what you want them to do, that does have undesired consequences. Mental health problems increase, vilification of outgroups like the unvaccinated. We've all witnessed that over the last year or so.
Very heinous here.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, the non-COVID collateral deaths, undoubtedly, fear has significantly contributed towards the excess non-COVID deaths by discouraging people from attending hospital with other medical problems, non-COVID problems, old people, dying of loneliness because people are too scared to visit them or they're too scared to go out. So there's ethical problems around the methods. Secondly, there's ethical problems around the goals. Should we be using these techniques to achieve goals that are by and large untested and non-evidenced? Before spring 2020, public health, of course, did not recommend lockdowns, did not recommend masking the healthy, did not recommend closing schools, etc., etc. Yeah. So my guess would be, and obviously this would be an empirical question to research, but my guess would be that the citizens of various countries would be rather more likely to accept the use of these techniques if they were towards the pursuit of goals like, reducing violent crime amongst young men, rather
or
than
healthy eating habits. What I see now too is that they use them for like the inclusive society and climate change and behavior, digitization. So these are really big policy areas where you would accept there's still like a lot of debate. And what I see with these COVID measures is that like the whole idea of behavioral science is what you say, like there's a cognitive conscious part where you can look at information and there's discussion, and there's a kind of underwater part that goes automatically and unconsciously. And you can use both, of course, but in this case, like all the people that try to look at like real information or have a scientific debate or like a debate at all, that seems to be not possible, like as if the government already made a decision about like what the right policy decisions are. So it's okay to do this behavioral manipulation, but it seems to negate like the possibility for debate even.
Yes, absolutely. And it's as if the science has been settled, which is far from true, really. And you mentioned climate change because nudging is rife within that at the moment. In fact, here in the UK, there was a recent document, a collaboration between Sky TV and the Behavioural Insight team, Yes, there's actually a document written by collectively by those two organisations, which was kind of advertising, and were pretty proud of themselves, really, saying that from now on, every programme, whether it was a drama, whether it was a comedy, whether it was a documentary, news programme, would all have these underpinning messages around carbon neutralisation and the agenda. So you couldn't even watch a drama now without being nudged by the state, and state television, etc. So yeah, and as I was just saying with regards to the ethics, and there's ethical problems around the methods, ethical problems around the goals, ethical problems like the one you just alluded to around transparency, although this is largely tapping in below our level of awareness, which is rather different from what traditional government methods have been to try and persuade the citizens to do things that they want them to do. In the past, they've used the slow brain stuff, haven't they? Give information, arguments, rational kind of reasoning, etc. So it's a rather different approach when they're kind of nudging to do these things. And the other big one, of course, ethically, is around informed consent. It's a cornerstone of all clinical practice, whether it's medical or psychological, that you don't inflict something or impose something on an individual without them giving permission. You do that with a psychological therapy technique. You wouldn't do it with a medical intervention. You'd give them all the information, give them the pros, the cons, the possible advantages and disadvantages, and say, over to you. So do you want us to go ahead?
So I actually wondered about this because, with medical experiments, of course, you have the Nuremberg principles for informed consent. Yep. And I was wondering about social psychological research, because you had the Stanford prison experiment of Philip Zimbardo. And within a week, that experiment ran amok, and the people who were conducting the research, they were so immersed in what was happening that they couldn't see that they were part of the experiment, basically. And it was other people from outside coming in, looking at what was happening, with the prisoners and the inmates, and they said, this is not right. And that's when it was stopped. So I was wondering, I know that after that there was discussion about the ethics of conducting these types of experiments, but has that resulted in guidelines of what kind of social experiments are allowed or not?
Yes, in fact, that would never get through the ethical committees these days. That experiment. Yes, there are guidelines. Each country probably has its own. We have our British Psychological Society. I'm sure there's an equivalent in the Netherlands, some kind of professional body that oversees the ethical practice of psychology. And there'll be protocols for research ethics, and deliberately inflicting distress on subjects would make it highly doubtful that such a project would be given the go-ahead. And the thing is here as well, which is really important, is prominent nudgers, prominent behavioural scientists like Professor David Halpern, who's currently the chief executive of the Behavioural Insight team, and in a way one of the key founders. He's written on more than one occasion about these nudge techniques should never be used without the full consent of these, in this case, British citizens. They should never be used. And there are ways of consent as well. That are, there's like deliberative forums where you get representative samples of the population together for a weekend's debate about the pros and cons, for instance, of using these things. But these approaches have been used in other areas of life over the last few decades, and we seem to have worked very well. But there's been, as far as I'm aware, no attempts to get the public's consent to using these approaches. And as I said, Professor Halpern's been very clear that we should never use these unless we've got the full commitment and agreement of the targets. So,
Well, I
as you
missed
alluded
that memo.
to earlier, I've been here. I and others have been pressing for an open debate about the ethical kind of basis of nudging. The thing you referred to was a letter we sent to the PACAC committee, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially is a cross-party government committee that do some comprehensive and independent reviews of key issues of the time. So we pushed and pushed for that, but the government doesn't seem to be interested in undertaking such a review. We tried to engage earlier, back in January 2021, wrote to the British Psychological Society, trying to get them to engage in an open debate about the ethics of these things. And put a long story short, they eventually responded in a very strident way, saying they didn't see any ethical problems with these approaches. Fear levels were proportionate to the objective risk posed by the virus, which again I think is rather a dubious assumption.
Yes.
And they were really proud of their psychologists for behaving in again we get that term, socially responsible way. So they were quite strident about it, although I perhaps shouldn't have been too surprised by that, because they are heavily conflicted in that some of the key people on the government advisory group for behavioural science are actually high flyers in the British Psychological Society as well. So I think I shouldn't have perhaps expected an impartial response from that body. I do think we do desperately need some transparency about this, about what's actually happening, because these people, and I'm sure most of them mean well, don't get me wrong, I'm sure they're not all kind of psychopaths lurking in our midst or anything. I think most of them mean well, but I think the public has a right to know how they are being influenced pretty much on an hour-by-hour basis, really, across a whole range of things, not just public health, but, as we said, climate change and many others. We even had a scandal here a few years ago around what we call the loan charge, where you've come across this, because I think the government made a loan to small businesses. This is going back to perhaps 2011, 2012, something like that, but then used a whole raft of behavioural science nudges to get them to pay up, to get them to repay the loan. And apparently, the at least nine of those targeted, committed suicide. They killed themselves. And in some of the inquests, behavioural science was actually implicated. Some of the methods that our tax office was using to recoup the loan was actually implicated in the suicides of some of these people.
So that's very heavy, what they call collateral damage. Have you seen similar effects with the corona messaging?
Well, I haven't personally, because I'm no longer working in services since my retirement. But my clinical psychology colleagues talk about the marked increase in mental health issues, anxiety, depression, suicidality, eating disorders that they're seeing in their clinics. And we have a whole raft of evidence of the mental health collateral damage, both in the UK, the US, and in other countries. The suicide stats in the UK tend to be quite, rather slow to emerge, because they have to go through, it's like a legal process about, the coroner has got to be clear that unequivocal, it was a suicide rather than misadventure or something else. So it tends to take a really long time for the figures to emerge. But I know in America, for instance, there's quite robust evidence over there of the increase in suicide since the restrictions. And of course, it's hard to tease out what's the restrictions per se and what's the methods used to get people's compliance with the restrictions. It's quite difficult to differentiate.
Well, and this collateral damage raises really profound questions about, Well, both responsibility and free choice. Because if you impose this, if you use these kind of measures and it has these kind of responses, then also like if in the Netherlands they use the jargon like we are adapting the choice architecture.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're steering people like towards a certain choice, and we're kind of like eliminating other options or making them very scary. But if you kind of like steered people unconsciously towards a choice and behavior came not from a conscious decision, but because they basically were being manipulated, who is responsible for the behavior then?
Mm. Yeah.
That's because I think like in a free society, you say we are free individuals and I'm responsible for my choices and behaviors. But if you use these super sophisticated manipulation methods and that's driving behavior, then yeah, to me that raises questions about like responsibility for like who's responsible if you've been been manipulated with scientifically sophisticated ways. Yeah, it's a question.
I think you raise a really important point. This kind of ignores the issue of individual responsibility. Personally, and I and many others think that individual responsibility is a good thing. That we're in a civilized, democratic society. Give us the information and let us make a choice. As long as we're not committing crimes, then it should be down to the individual. But this takes it's quite paternalistic, isn't it? It's quite infantilizing in a way. It kind of takes the choice away from individuals and says the state knows best. Sorry, but I don't think the state should kind of put out a little bit here, because I think state should be there to form a safety net for us and maybe protect our borders or whatever. But the state intervention in people's lives should be limited. And here, I think this huge overreach. And again, back to this issue of, they think they know what's right. It's as if it's a done deal. The science is settled. We hear this around COVID. Science is settled. And of course, it's certainly not. These are very contentious policies, these restrictions, unevidenced, very controversial. Huge amounts of censorship. I never thought I'd see the day when we'd have the level of censorship, not just of the media, but in science as well. Science isn't science anymore, I'm sad to say. You actually look, most of the science that's produced, in inverted commas, isn't science. It's just propaganda for government to get their view across. And that's a really sad state of affairs. And I think we really do need to expose that and make people aware of actually what's happening across not just public health, as I've said, but across pretty much every other aspect of our life. Green agenda, tax collection. These big scientists are embedded in every nook and cranny of the state at the moment, and they're expanding. And governments like it because I think they see it as efficient. They see it more power, gives them more control. Hence their reluctance really to have an open, transparent debate about it.
So what can we do to bring, of course we have this conversation and I'm publishing about it, but what other things can we do to bring more transparency to these measures? For example, how can people recognize these nudges?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, of course. I think there's a number of ways that people can almost like protect themselves in a way. The most obvious one is to switch off the mainstream media, to get several hours away from watching videos and TV. Particularly again, I don't know what you're like over in the Netherlands, but here in the UK, pretty much all the main TV channels, again, have just been mouthpieces for the government. In fact, they were kind of forced really to just give the dominant narrative.
I find it so odd because it was so repetitive, all the same messaging, it was fear mongering, and I thought, why don't people recognize this as propaganda? I think it was, I know.
It's like mass hypnotism, though, isn't it? I think once a person becomes in a particular mind state, cognitive biases then take over. So, for example, just one key example would be around fear. Now, if you frighten people, which they did from a very early part of this by non-contextualized death statistics and case statistics and scary footage of people dying in acute hospitals in Lombardy in Italy, I think it was initially, that we got bombarded with, coffins piling up in New York. Now, if you scare people enough from the outset, that has a significant impact then on how they make sense of the world. If you're fearful, your memory will be distorted. You can only remember, or you preferentially remember, scary things from your past. Your focus of attention in the here and now will be distorted in that you tend to selectively focus on scary things and ignore the not so scary. And the way you interpret your world will be distorted, and you'll tend to distort it in a much more threatening way than if you weren't frightened in the first place. So it's almost, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that these things are self-fulfilling in a way. Once you're activated, whether that be frightened or shamed, etc., you no longer see the world in an impartial way anymore. You have all these biases, which then propagates that mind state and makes you impervious to alternatives. So get away from mainstream media. We're quite lucky at the moment here in the UK. We have one or two channels that do push, not push, maybe they do push, but they do share an alternative narrative. We have like GB News over here, which is a relatively new channel. And they've got lots of sceptical views on there, including sceptical views of the vaccines as well, which is quite interesting. But our mainstream media was just censored from the outset. Our Ofcom, our regulator, our media regulator, said back in, I think it was March 2020, told the mainstream media, you must only relay the government narrative around COVID. If you deviate from that, there will be penalties. They were actually told that. Advertising, of course, back in 2020, the commercial TV channels lost the bulk of their advertising revenue because everything was shut down. And the government stepped in with their kind of revenue to publish their advert. So in a way, the mainstream media were in a difficult position, but it would have been nice to see some more independent journalism, a bit like yourself.
Well, here, it's actually sometimes difficult because we are a platform that's completely reader funded. So with subscriptions, we don't take advertising money. But very often, when I approach people for interviews, they say, well, you're fake news. Or you're like conspiracy thinkers, or you get, there's a whole list of slurs for people who try to. And then when I look at how we work, that we select our sources, we are transparent about who we talk with. We try to be a platform that discusses be a platform for every topic as long as it's kind of supported. Even though the Netherlands has a number of alternative news sources or new media, but in the mainstream, we're all being labeled as extreme rights.
It's a really lazy way of dismissing an alternative viewpoint, isn't it? In fact, when I used to battle with psychiatrists over this back in the day, they used to use the same tactics. You're just anti-psychiatry. You're an anti-psychiatry extremist. So well, just deal with the content of the argument. Don't just to try and discredit the messenger, which is what tends to happen. We've got a paper over here. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. It seems like it's similar to yours in the Netherlands, which is here we call it the Light. the Light
Oh yes,
newspaper.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's reader funded, I think, and does put forward some alternative viewpoints, which is refreshing. But with regards to the question of what we can do, yes, I think we need to get away from mainstream media some of the time, difficult though that is. I think we need to learn about nudges. Like I have a blog, coronababble.com, we call it, coronababble.com, and I run a few months ago now. One of the blogs I run was a Nudge of the Week competition.
Oh yeah.
They were trying to get people to put their antennae out and start to become aware of what nudging was actually happening in the news over that particular week. It was quite fun and hopefully quite helpful as well, because people started to recognise that source. I see what that's doing. So I think that helps. You can get more formal training in things like mindfulness as well, which I think helps you to stay in the moment and get you out of that automatic pilot. But sometimes just simple things like, I know it sounds a bit twee, but just going for a walk in the countryside and nature and just getting away from TV, video, and just going back to our natural roots just for a few minutes reflection can be really helpful as well. And learn an alternative narrative helps then, of course, to actually have some other way of explaining what's happened over the last 2.5 years.
So what I also see, so there are a lot of people because they have been kind of like conditioned right now to mistrust alternative media. So how can they get out of their cognitive dissonance?
Yes, so we have this debate a lot with when we're talking about how can we actually influence more people to step out of their, whatever we want to call it, the massive north maybe. And I and many others, I think, are very strongly of the view that with some people we're wasting our time. That's sad to say at the moment. I think that the more extreme proponents of the dominant narrative who've been arguing stridently for it for the last 2 years or so, we're not really going to influence those in the foreseeable. They're there. So what we've got to concentrate on is the middle, the silent middle, as we call them. The ones that do have some degree of doubts about what's going on, but haven't really voiced them. The wonderful Canadian journalist called Julius Seychelles, a Canadian, he's written some good stuff on this. Very, very, very perceptive, I think. Now, he talks about the silent middle. And what's this phrase he uses? Something about we've got to break the illusion of consensus. So we've got to break this illusion that pretty much all on board with what's going on. And I think the best way to do that, and it often takes bravery in the current climate, is to make our dissent visible. Not in an antagonistic way. Find a bit of common ground with people. There usually is some. If we're arguing about childhood vaccination, for instance, we can all agree that we all want what's best for our younger generation and protect our children's future. We agree on that, don't we? You can always start from a commonality, something that you agree on. So we all know we both got broadly the same aims. We just differ in how we might want to go about it, and that kind of stops you getting stuck in the extremist conspiracy theory boxes, the flat earthers. It stops you getting stuck in those boxes, and just make our dissent visible. Again, easier for me to do than a lot of people who are still working on the front line. My mortgage isn't dependent upon me keeping my job, but I do think, and I'm pleased to say, I think dissent is growing, certainly, that just by making our dissent visible and noticeable to others. When we're at the hairdressers or at the travel agents, just casual dropping things into conversations. Like somebody asked me the other day, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I'm on a group, a family group, where we usually once a year we go abroad to Germany for a kind of a lads and dads celebration. And they asked if I'd be going this year. I said, no, I better not. I said, why not? I said, well, they're still we're still asking at this time for vaccination passes, and I'm not vaccinated. And you kind of get like a stony silence for a bit. But I think it's important, because I like to think that they think I'm a reasonably sensible bloke. I'm not, not an idiot. And but just talking with hairdressers when I'm the haircut, and just talking about some of the restrictions, that I just think they're unjustified. And just getting it in at every opportunity. I think that's probably the best way, because I do think we just need a critical mass of visible dissent.
Yes.
And I don't think that would need to be very high, really. There's some research that suggests you can get somewhere between 10 and 15% of visible dissent to a tyrannical kind of regime, which I think that's what we're all saying. It flips. You don't need a majority. You need a certain critical mass, and so therefore, I'm waffling on a bit there, and I apologise, but I do think that we do to try and make our dissent visible. General sense about what's happened over the last 2.5 years, and specifically, I do think we've all got a right to know about the way that state is using behavioural science to get us to do what they think is the right thing, and I think that debate needs to be had. We need more transparency. More people need to know how they are being influenced. Because I do.
Yeah. So you've been asking for a public inquiry. So I think that would be a good thing, also from the government itself, and then being aware of these nudges and showing your dissent. And so in the Netherlands, it's interesting because they're trying to disown farmers, and now they're trying to take the land from farmers.
Oh right, yes, of course, I've been following that. Yes, and getting very little coverage on our TV channels. But GB News, that the alternative has been covering it. It's been showing the tractors all blocking the roads and all that kind of thing. Yes. Sorry.
So we have these farmer scarves, and so it's like a red scarf, and I think everyone has one at home. But now that's become kind of a symbol of dissent. And you see that it's not just dissent about like this land being taken, but you see there's a piling up of all these government measures that doesn't really have support among the population. And what I saw last Sunday or Saturday, there was a big protest, and you saw so during the corona protest, the police would show up and they would use water cannons. And then the protesters, they would show up with yellow umbrellas, and they would adorn them with all these hippie-like texts with love and peace and hugs and freedom. So these yellow umbrellas have become the symbol, but now these farmer scarves, and they're hanging the flag upside down. Apparently, I didn't know this, but hanging a flag upside down is a symbol of a country in distress. And so if you go through the main provincial roads, then like every lamppost almost has one of these flags in the agricultural areas.
I like it. It's visible
so that's
dissent.
becoming visible. Yes.
Sounds a bit like the Canadian truckers in a way, doesn't it? The Canadian truckers, that same kind of thing where, again, the mainstream media tried to ignore it. I know here in the UK, we went on demonstrations in central London against the restrictions, and there were, must have been 70 to 100,000 people at a couple of them, and the mainstream media just ignored it. Or if they did report it, it would talk about some kind of fringe violence that was taking place by these right-wing extremists, and they're every walk of life. Personally, I'd never been on a demonstration until summer 2020. And the furthest thing away from a conspiracy theorist that you could ever imagine. I was quite naive. I kind of swallowed what I was told by and large by our government. Got my head down, worked hard, and tried to do the responsible thing. But from 2020, that all changed. But I do like the farmers stuff. I think gives us all hope. I think we need much more of that kind of visible protest, that visible dissent.
And non-violent. I think that's important too.
Of course,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, no violence. Yeah, just visible and not necessarily confrontational. I know we don't have to be adversarial about it either. In fact, it's best if we're not, because no one likes to be told that they've got it wrong or that they've been an idiot, do they? No one likes to be called a sheep, which is something that's crept into the vocabulary. And that might make us feel better transiently for a while, but it doesn't really help persuade. We've got to find common ground. And once you find common ground, then start to share information that's not too far away from where they already are, because then you can accommodate that and maybe adapt to that and move on a little bit and move up and down that continuum.
So try to connect with people who are doubting and make it visible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the way to do it. Very difficult, and like I said, easier for people like me who are retired. I so admire those who are still in frontline jobs, those minority of individuals who are speaking out while they're actually on the health service frontline or in the legal profession or in any profession for that matter, who are brave enough to put their head above the parapet at the moment. This isn't right. This is not right. This is not the direction of travel we should be following.
So I have another question. It doesn't really relate to nudges, but it does relate to the psychological dynamics, because what I notice for like my friends who are still like in regular workplaces is that the vaccination side effects are piling up, and you will even see this in the mainstream media. And I see that the people who are reading more alternative news, they recognize like these are side effects from this vaccination campaign. But the people who have taken the jabs, there's really strong denial. And I can actually understand this, because that's a big step if you have taken 2 boosters and you have to recognize that's and what I saw now too is this a promotion by like a big mass media paper of a story of a doctor who made a medical mistake and how they dealt with it. So trying to make it easier to talk about medical mistakes. So I think we're kind of on the verge between it. Like, where do they, this denial part, like how can we reach them or help them? And I was thinking about like, especially the doctors, because they've been pretty fanatical and they've been delivering all these jabs. And right now they're on the front line. So I heard about a gynecologist who thought, oh, I'm getting so many more women with menstrual disorders. And then in neurology, it's the same thing. And with cardiac issues and with car accident, but they are in the front line. So they see all this happening. So they have like an extra step they need to take. Like if you are like the victim and you've been manipulated and you've taken this and you have to recognize like this is a bad thing, that's already a big step. But if you have to recognize, well, I have injected like more than 100 people, or I don't know, 500, that's like in the army they call this moral injury. But like so what do you think is going to happen there? How?
I take your point. I think there are professionals, doctors who assumed that the dominant narrative around the vaccines was an accurate one. Having worked in the health service for 30 odd years, I do know the tendency that professionals have to follow protocols. If it's passed down above, they don't really think too much about it. They just this is easy, this is what we need to do, and they'll follow it. And I think you're absolutely right that those, for example, doctors who've been pushing the vaccines and the nursing staff, etc., who've been pushing the vaccines and encouraging people to take them, including young people and in some cases children, for them to start to accept and digest they may have been pushing something that wasn't in not weren't in their own interest, but weren't in the interest of their patients, is a huge step. And we're back again to the cognitive dissonance thing we were talking about earlier. If people believe something for so long and have behaved in a way consistent with it, that really does strengthen that particular version of the world. And for them to kind of abandon that and come back to saying, oh, I'm holding my hand up, I've done wrong or I've made mistakes, does take a lot of bravery. But hopefully that's what will happen, because the thing is as well, I know we moved on a little bit from nudges, but nudges have been used around the vaccination program.
Yes.
We had a document in the UK that was advising teenagers and young people that unless you get vaccinated, then everybody else's freedom is not going to actually be returned. So, you must get vaccinated, not just for you, but for the whole of the population. So like an ego, you're a bad person if you don't get vaccinated. We've had advertisements, and these are really nauseating, aimed at children, calling them, you superheroes, come to the vaccination centre. Again, the implication being if you're not a superhero, it is something
We have
else.
a government advertisement, and this boy is like 9 years old, and he says, well, if you're double vaccinated, I think you have more freedom.
Yeah.
And that's a government commercial.
Well, that's been one of the frustrating things, I think, isn't it? Is that a lot of people, understandably, I guess, have been what we might call hassle avoiders. I've had spoken with lots of people who don't really agree with the masking, for instance, or they don't agree with the vaccination mandates and vaccine certificates, passes and so on. But they want to go on holiday, and they don't want to get harassed on the bus, this kind of thing. So they kind of, it's only a mask, it's only a jab. I think there's been quite a lot of those. And I think that's the ambivalent, that silent middle. I think that we can kind of have some influence on a lot of those people. And I think we are doing, actually. There are some positive signs. I think more and more people are questioning, the dominant narrative now. A number of people, for instance, they're pushing monkeypox on our television at the moment. In the Netherlands, and the World Health Organization, got it out as what is it?
Pea hike.
Yes, another pandemic kind of thing threatening the world. And a lot more people I've noticed are kind of going, almost like laughing at this. We had two really hot days. I think you've had a heat wave over in the Netherlands. Yes. We had two very hot. It was very hot. Two very hot days, but I think it was Armageddon. Many of us have been paying money to go to southern Spain to experience those temperatures. But here on the television, the end of the world was nigh. It really is scare tactic, and it's getting to ridiculous proportions. And I think more and more people are kind of cottoning on and beginning to recognise it is. I do hope so.
Yeah, in the Netherlands there was a picture of like children eating ice cream, and then a paper said, well, they don't understand the gravity of the situation.
Yes. You see the comparison of the weather charts as well, going back to the 1970s or something, when it was hot. You had a picture of the United Kingdom. They used to have like smiley, sunny faces on in yellow. Where it was hot. Now it's all red and deep red and warning, kind of signs. Really kind of a juxtaposition of those two is quite striking, really. And in a way, that's what again, a debate I have with colleagues around this is, in a way, it's quite tempting to start nudging back and start using fear, start using shame, start using normative pressure, etc., to get people to become more sceptical. But obviously, there would be somewhat hypocritical to do that in a way, although there's a debate to be had about red lines, about what we can and can't use to try and influence people. And that's what I want, really, when I'm pushing for an independent review and pushing the Psychological Society to engage in an open debate about it. I want us to have a framework to contain state-funded nudging in the future. Now, this should be operating to an ethical framework. There should be some red lines in there,
Yes.
maybe consent of some sort, maybe around the type of methods used. Let's have the debate. I think that's the least we can expect. So I'll keep on pushing that for the foreseeable.
Well, I think, and it's also the combination with censorship, because as long as you can have debates, then there can be nudges. But if you have the facts, then you think, well, this virus has an IFR that's very low, so for the most people, they are not really at risk. And so I was reading that information, and that's why when I saw all the fear mongering, I thought, why? So if there's a real free press and a possibility of a rational debate, and there are scientists who say, well, there's no necessity for all this fear, then perhaps these nudges cannot be that effective.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we do need transparency. I have some colleagues who say that covert nudging should always be prohibited, but I think that's probably unrealistic now and maybe undesirable. These things have been around for a long time in the private sector and as well as in state use. Personally, as one example, I could imagine if I joined a slimming club or something, slimming centre or whatever we want to call it. There's nothing to stop the organisers or something like that saying, look, we would like to use some nudges to help you to reduce your dietary intake or do more exercise. This is broadly the kind of things that we'll be using. Are you okay with that? And then you could say no. And if you say yes, then fine, because there's evidence that it doesn't really reduce the impact of them that much, even if you're quite aware that they're going to take place. They still have an influence. So, if you want to put the salads more prominently in front of me when I'm going through the canteen, okay, that's great. If you want to scare me a little bit into doing a bit more exercise, if I consent to that, then that's fine. So I think there is a place for these things, and the genie's already out the bottle. So I think it's unrealistic to assume that these aren't going to be used anymore. But let's have a very clear ethical framework and some red lines for how the state, which is our money after all, at the end of the day, taxpayers' money, how the state actually uses these things. I think we should have a say and know about what's going on.
Definitely. So I think I've asked all my questions. Is there anything else that you would like to add, or?
Just really, I suppose, is just how I still struggle to believe what's happened over the last 2.5 years. And it's so frustrating when many of my friends, colleagues, just don't seem to get it. Maybe I've lost the plot. Maybe I've got off at the deep end. I don't think I have. It's just so frustrating, and it's just also so quite fascinating as well in another way, because some of the new friends I've made over the last couple of years are people that perhaps I wouldn't have met otherwise. Like, for example, political spectrum. I've always seen myself as a pretty much a middle of the road person, really. If anything, probably slightly right of centre, but not, certainly not an extreme right winger or an extreme left winger. But this is across all the political dimensions, really. Some of our local group of skeptics, there's people from across the political spectrum, some real staunch left wingers who I would have probably fought with incessantly at one time. I went on holiday with some recently. We get on these days, right through to some, certainly on the media, social media, some kind of right-wing spokespeople who I probably wouldn't have particularly followed, have been that interested in, and now just kind of speaking our language. So I'm still kind of getting my head around what's happened, like we all are, I think, to some extent.
Well, it's interesting that you say that about the new coalitions, because I remember when I saw Naomi Wolf with Steve Bannon, I thought, who would have thought that?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's turned everything upside down, hasn't it? It really
So,
has.
and then I spoke to Edward Dowd, and he said something similar. He said, I'm speaking to so many different people, and he said, some of them are vegans. I like my barbecue, but he said, we're all on team humanity. Like, we
Yeah,
just want our freedom back and
yeah.
not have all this hassle from the government.
That's right. I mean, we've got a model being able to have an uncensored debate and differ, haven't we, have different opinions. You know,
Yes.
that's there's an holiday with this group, and we disagree on a lot of political issues, and we have some quite
Hmm.
lively debates about them, but we can still remain respectful because
Yes.
because we're driven by our scepticism around the climate stuff in a way. But we're able to have that kind of debate and still socialise the following day. You know, and it's we need more of that.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, thank you very much for sharing your insights. It's been very
Well,
helpful.
no, enjoyed it. How do you pronounce it? Is it Elsa? Elsa?
Elsa, yes.
Elsa, yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity. I'm always happy to speak about these things. The more outlets that we can have for spreading the word and making dissent visible,
Yes.
the better. And I do hope that your farmers have some further success in their campaigns. 'Cause I think that's a really important one at the moment.
Yes, and so they are also opening like their farms and you can buy their produce directly there. So kind of bypassing the supermarkets.
Mm.
So
Good,
so
good.
a whole new initiatives and new networks are emerging. But may you live in interesting times. That's the saying, right?
But finally, I'm always amazed at the wonderful linguistic ability of the Dutch people. I've always been fascinated by that from when I used to hitchhike around Arnhem and around northern Germany and into Holland, Netherlands. Now, I used to hitchhike in my younger days around there, and I met a lot of people. And the linguistic ability puts us to shame here in the UK. We are so lazy with regards to languages, and you speak so fluently.
Oh, thank you.
I'm always, I'm always
But it's
amazed.
only English. I know the previous generation would also learn French and German, but for me it was only English.
I always thought they were pretty fluent in four when I was around.
Yeah.
It's narrowed a bit now. It's just English, is it?
Yes. Well, for me then. I think
Still
some
pretty.
people learn Spanish, but it's not standard. Yeah.
Yeah, it used to be German, Dutch, English, and
French.
French, I think French. Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So
Okay,
good.
well, I hope you have every success. And please feel free to give me a shout if you want to have another chat or want to discuss something or run something past me.
Good.
Always happy to do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.